In this lecture, we're looking at Elizabeth I and the rise of later Anglicanism. We pick up in this point where we were in our last lecture on Anglicanism, where we had traced the story from Henry VIII all the way through the reign of Edward VI. And Edward died in 1553, taking with him all of the hopes that England would proceed step by step over years, all the way until the point where it was fully reformed, or Protestant, you might say. Not reformed in the sense of being Calvinistic, though it certainly treaded that way during the course of Edward's reign. One of the examples of this is the fact that in the Reformed world, as opposed to the Lutheran world, you see a great deal of what we call iconoclasm. Now, iconoclasm just means the destruction of icons, and it's generally a position that is opposed to the use of art in worship. Now, this is important to grasp. The issue with iconoclasm is always to do with worship. There have been, over the years, pretty intensified iconoclasts who have been opposed to the use of Christian art at all. But they're in the minority. The majority of people, whenever they're discussing iconoclasm, come at it from a position of worship. Now, Luther, in his day, right after he came out of the Wartburg Castle, after his year in exile when he was translating the German New Testament and these kinds of things, he actually comes back to Wittenberg in part because a man by the name of Andreas Karlstadt, one of Luther's right-hand men who had gone a bit funky, gone a bit extreme in his understanding of the Lutheran Reformation, had, amongst other things, begun to destroy in really sort of violent clashes so much of the art and the images that had been part of the churches there, both in Wittenberg and throughout all of Catholic Europe. Well, when Luther comes out of the Wartburg, he comes to really put a stop to this. From a theological position, Luther really didn't care all that much about statues or icons. Luther's issue here with iconoclasm, though, really fits more with his understanding of what we think we're doing in worship. Luther's primary goal always in worship is to preach law and gospel and to partake in the sacraments. He is always going to be allergic to the idea that if we cleanse the worship or if we do certain things that we think we're making God happy. That really is more the theological position he's coming from. To that end, he really doesn't have a theology or a position, you might say, on where art and images in the worship should or should not be used. His main concern is always with this self-justifying move that we always make, where we attempt to radicalize ourselves because we feel we're making God happy. Now, not everyone has liked Luther's position, but in general, where he's coming from is a not unsympathetic view to those who will be called Reformed down the line on this issue. Luther just thinks, preach the gospel and do the sacraments, and eventually, without being forced to, the people will stop treating these things idolatrously. They will cease to have a grasp on their minds and on their hearts. He's also a bit sensitive to the idea that if you merely destroy them, you're wounding someone who needs to hear the gospel first. And so by doing, you end up ruining the very thing you're trying to do. Now, by and large, within Protestantism, that position by Luther is idiosyncratic. From the Reformed world in all of its varieties, both in the Swiss regions, in the French regions, in Scotland and other places, they're going to be pretty uncomfortable, if not quite hostile to the idea of the use of any imagery within the context of worship. And their theology comes more from the issue that they believe that any use of these kinds of things, even good ones, hypothetically speaking, say a statue of Christ or a crucifix, is not wrong in and of itself. It's not a talisman that is going to do some kind of hex on the person if they look upon it. They're not superstitious against icons or images, though perhaps in some cases you can find this kind of thing, particularly amongst the mobs who occasionally will enact a violent attack on a church and its iconography. The issue, though, for them is, to quote Calvin in one of his other places in his writings, that they believe that the heart is a factory for idols. Now, Calvin doesn't have in mind the Industrial Revolution yet, of course. He's not thinking of an assembly line factory. But rather what he means is our hearts are always prone to wander. They're always prone to put our hope in things and not in God himself. And so where Calvin and other Reformed people come from is a position that at times you need to take these things out of the hands of the laity. Now, he's going to be opposed to violence, but in general, if, let's say, the Genevan leadership there decided that they were going to remove all icons and art and stained glass, depicting images at least, not just merely color. If they're going to remove these things, Calvin will applaud. He sees it more as a pastoral and a leadership responsibility not to leave dangerous things before the laity who may not have the categories or the Christian maturity to really understand what these things are used for. Well, when you cast about to the English Reformation under Edward, you see exactly this kind of move. It's one of the indications that Edward's reign and those within it trend reformed. They're not Calvinistic again, but they're trending not so much towards the Lutheran position on these kinds of reforms, but they're going to actually be on the Reformed axis of things. And so under Edward, you see all kinds of art and images. A lot of the destruction of the traditional churches up and down England happened during Edward's reign. Now, Henry had suppressed some of the monasteries. He had suppressed the big ones, and he had confiscated their monies. But Henry's intentions in this were not theological, they were political. He felt that, in particular, the large monasteries and many of the monastic order there in England were out to get him, at least in terms of their ideas about his having kicked the Pope out. And so the Henrician suppression of the monasteries was not so much a theological conviction that he wanted to lurch the church into a more reformed position on things. To my knowledge, and frankly, I've never seen any evidence to the contrary, Henry is pretty oblivious to what's going on in the Swiss regions. He would probably not have identified anything as being reformed per se. Under Edward, it's different. They take out just about every element of the traditional Catholic worship, not only in terms of the liturgy, but also in terms of the architecture and of the panoply, you might say, of all of the color and variety and all these things that were part of traditional worship. As one of the books recently on this period of time calls it, this was a stripping of the altars. Well, Edward died, 1553, and with him went this more robust Protestantism. And as we said in our lecture on early Anglicanism, we suddenly have Mary Tudor rise to the throne. Now, Mary has had an unfortunate history in terms of the legacy of the memory of her. Mary Tudor goes by the unfortunate name of Bloody Mary. And it's sometimes hard to do it justice, particularly when you see art depicting the older Mary as queen. Many people just feel that she just looks a bit dour and cross there sitting on the throne. But let me go ahead and ask you a question. If you had been a princess, if you were the firstborn of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and if in the course of your young life, during the course of your development into maturity, your father had cast off your mother, cast off her religion, had instigated policies that really did a disservice to your mother, and not only that, if the king, your father, Henry, had you declare publicly before the court that you were a bastard, that your very existence as a princess should be called into doubt, do you think you're going to be very happy about being Protestant, or do you think you're going to embrace any of these things? Obviously, the answer is no. Mary was devoutly Catholic. All throughout Edward's reign, she actually, from time to time, kept a priest somewhat hidden within her estate where she was living, her confessor and the man who would do mass for her. There was one case where Edward wanted to get rid of the man, and they tried to find him, and they hid the man so that he wouldn't be found and taken away. Edward wrote letters to Mary pleading with her to come over to the Protestant faith, but of course she would have none of it. Not only that, but due to the realities of the lineage in this day, because she was a female, she was hopped in line and Edward went first. Now, this was uncontroversial in general, at least there were no people complaining about this in this day. This was, frankly, just how things went very often, not only in the Middle Ages, but here in the early modern period. But from Mary's position, Edward, frankly, should not have been on the throne. Edward was the son of Henry and his third wife, Jane Seymour. And, at least according to Mary, her lineage, her right and claim to the throne, superseded his. In addition, when she came to the throne in 1553, now being the first female to rule in England as queen, she was also, frankly, getting on in years in terms of being able to have children. The biggest issue for Mary was, who is she going to marry? Again, given the traditionalism of the way the lineages worked, if she were to marry someone within the nobility of England, what this would do is it would raise one family up from being a lesser noble to being a house that does not have a claim to the throne, to suddenly having this house have a claim to the throne. And not only that, but given the marriage laws of the day or the marriage assumptions of the day, because he would be head of the household, he would be head of his wife, Mary, though queen, would be unable, in some regards, at least this was the conspiracy theory, to handle her own business, and therefore whoever she married would become de facto King of England, and she would become merely the queen. Keep this in mind in a minute when we look at Elizabeth, because Elizabeth will never marry. Well, Mary does decide to wed, and she chooses the Habsburg dynasty, the dynasty that held control over the Holy Roman Empire and from whom her mother had been descended. And she married Philip of Spain. Now, this brought all kinds of anxiety amongst the Protestants because, again, this was the family that had put Luther on trial, that was going to war with the Lutheran faith, and in other parts of Europe, the places that they controlled, they were suppressing the Protestant message. In particular, in the Netherlands, for example, there was a knot of those who were coming up Protestant, who were beginning to do things like publish, and frankly, the Netherlands, at least certain parts of it, had long been bastions of Reformed or Protestant thinking. And during Mary's life, while Philip was her husband, in fact, he spent a great deal of time suppressing the faith there in the Netherlands. Their marriage, though, was really on rocky soil. Interpersonally, there really wasn't much of a spark or a connection. Again, Mary was a bit on in years, and Philip had concerns and issues further afield out in other parts of Europe. One of the more troubling things about Mary, and I really choose to see her as an unfortunate soul who was abused and who attempted to live according to her principles, however much I have trouble with the way she does it. But one of the more tragic things is, on not one occasion but two, Mary believes that she is pregnant. And historians have always tried to figure this out. Frankly, it's a mystery. But on two occasions, she proclaims that she's pregnant. She gets to the moment where it is supposed to be the case where she's having a child. She withdraws, and then you kind of hear crickets in the background. And suddenly she comes back out with no baby and at least the sting of appearing to have lied about this. One of the issues with this, of course, is historians know that later on she dies of stomach cancer. It should go without explanation, of course, that they don't have MRIs or sonograms or anything to look within her womb to tell what's going on. They barely, frankly, know anything about female anatomy and reproductive cycles. So whether or not she was confused by the signs that her body was giving her, or whether or not she was delusional about her pregnancies, these are real signs of some of the troubles interpersonally, not in terms of her faith, but interpersonally with the fact that she felt as if she was a woman who had been wronged, and that perhaps if she had been younger, if her father had embraced her and treated her with the kindness that he ought to have treated her, she, at the very least, should have been married to another house, maybe in another country, just like many from the Tudor extended family had over the years. Now, why is Mary known as Bloody Mary? Well, the answer is because she reimposed Catholicism on England, and over the course of her 5 years of reign, she burned or had executed somewhere in the neighborhood of about 300 Protestants. Not only that, but close to 1,000 fled. Protestant leaders, pastors, bishops, layfolk, all kinds of people ended up fleeing to the continent. The majority of those who fled land in cities like Strasbourg, Geneva, Zurich, and other places, all up and down what we would call the Reformed axis. This is due in large part to two reasons. One, those leaving, those who had been part of the Edwardian Reformation, many of them could not embrace the Lutheran understanding of the sacraments. And we mentioned this before in a previous video. In order to reside within a Lutheran city, you had to be significantly comfortable, let's say, with the doctrine of physical eating and a number of other things. But in particular, their sacramentology was not clearly Lutheran. And people, again, need to know this. If you go to the Book of Common Prayer that Cranmer had written, particularly the 1552 version, during the Eucharistic liturgy, there's a very clear indication of what's going on here. Cranmer writes in there, towards the end, right before the distribution of the elements for communion to the laity, feed on him in your heart by faith with thanksgiving. Now, a theologian might believe that this is ambiguous, that feeding on him in your heart is certainly not saying that this is merely a memorial. Well, that's because not many people other than Zwingli and those living in Zurich would say that it was merely a memorial. Calvin and Butzer and all kinds of other Reformed people believed Christ was present in the Eucharist. They just believed he was present spiritually by the Holy Spirit. Zwingli is more in that line as well, but he often gets a bad rap of being believed to have said that Christ was nowhere in the sacrament. He doesn't actually say that. He's rather so strongly against physical eating that he doesn't spend as much time talking about the positives of spiritual eating. Well, when you go to the Book of Common Prayer, and it says, feed on him in your heart, that in your heart bit, those few words, does trend, again, towards a modified Reformed position. It's not overtly Lutheran. So that's one of the reasons why the Marian exiles, as they're known, end up in Reformed areas. The other is because, frankly, Mary had wed Philip, who was part of the Habsburg dynasty, so that made these exiles essentially political rebels against the crown. And believe me, if you're a political rebel, you're not going to move to the Habsburg lands, which are generally there in the Lutheran lands. Even areas that might have accepted these exiles, if they might have overlooked their sacramentology, would not have played fast and loose with this. For Charles' son, Philip, to be married to the woman, the Queen Mary, who these figures were in protest against and who were leaving, would have been, let's just say, not a good idea. The issue with Mary, though, as we transition from her to Elizabeth's reign, is, again, because she's called Bloody Mary, it's often alleged that she was wildly unpopular. All of the books on the English Reformation tend to argue that what Mary does when she comes to the throne is she essentially makes, unintentionally, England lurch even further towards Protestantism. The idea here is that Henry got it going, Edward and the Privy Council pushed it further, and then when Mary comes on the throne and she's so nasty and bitter, it is again alleged, with not much evidence, that everyone in England just goes, boy, this is awful, I hate these Catholics. And so by the time Elizabeth comes to the throne, it's believed that everyone's ready for a Protestant nation. The fact of the matter is that's not really true. The persecutions under Mary are certainly awful, they're bad. But as I often tell students, this is a very bloody age. All kinds of folks are being executed, not just for their faith, and not just by Catholics. There are Protestant countries and Protestant areas where people are killed. One example of this, in fact, Elizabeth, the one who is beloved so much by the English peoples, as the one who stitched back together this Anglican heritage. She killed not 300, but 1,000 Catholics, in not over 5 years, but over the span of several weeks. There had been a protest, an uprising up in the north during her reign, and she and the government cracked down hard on this. And so just by the law of numbers, you've got to kind of scratch your head about this. Mary is Bloody Mary, the awful tyrant queen who everyone hates, and she kills 300 and exiles 1,000. Elizabeth, the glorious one, the Protestant Anglican queen, kills 1,000 Catholics, and we just shrug our shoulders. We have to be a bit careful about this. There is no real evidence that what Mary was doing was wildly unpopular. In fact, as we saw under Edward, a lot of the populace was still relatively Catholic. Well, Mary dies in 1558, and she toyed with the idea of executing her sister for treason and for her role in supporting Protestantism in general, but she doesn't in the end, and she leaves the country to her sister, and she dies, frankly, knowing that what's going to happen is that when Elizabeth comes to the throne, there's going to be a reinstitution of Protestantism there in England. And so in 1558, Elizabeth I comes to the throne, now the second queen to have ruled in England. She ruled from 1558 to 1603, an enormously long period of time. In many ways, what Elizabeth is able to achieve during her reign, the real galvanizing of an English ethos, the real rise of English culture, happens because she is so stable and she reigns for so long. You don't have just a few years back and forth as you've had for the last 2 generations. Well, Elizabeth is remembered very highly all throughout the centuries within English culture. Her nickname is Gloriana, the glorious one. And a lot of this has to do not only with her own personality and the very striking ways that she ruled a male nobility and parliament as a woman, an unmarried woman, and at times has a great deal of fun tweaking their noses about this. Really sort of puts her in the limelight. She is pretty phenomenal in terms of her personal skill and leadership. But it's also under Elizabeth that you have the rise of the Shakespearean playwright culture, with all these wonderful things beginning to arise that, again, are read in universities and by aficionados of literature and the stage, even until the modern world. You see the English language really come into its own under Elizabeth. In fact, when we talk about things having a Tudor feel to them, whether it's Tudor architecture or whatnot, we often mean this Shakespearean Elizabethan culture that is so much beloved throughout history. Well, what about her faith? What about the Anglican Church during Elizabeth's reign? Well, just as with Mary, if you look at Mary's background in her mother and her mother's relationship to Henry, you might say that Elizabeth in some ways embodies the very Reformation in England herself. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, the one, frankly, who propelled Henry into the Reformation, however piecemeal he wanted it to be. Elizabeth is not going to be Catholic. There is absolutely no case that she's going to be. Historians and those at the popular level often tend to say things like Elizabeth was a, quote, conservative in her religious outlook. And by that, they mean that she's some kind of Anglo-Catholic. She's some kind of person halfway between being a Protestant and a Catholic. As we'll see here, that is the furthest thing from the truth. There are things that Elizabeth likes that people don't like, but by and large, the things that are being squabbled over are not the things of traditional Catholicism. They're the more ticky-tack issues, you might say. There are things like a crucifix. Elizabeth kept a crucifix in her private chapel for her private devotional time. And on multiple occasions, an angry Protestant person within the court comes in, breaks the crucifix, and throws it on the floor. Of course, they never get caught because they do it when no one's looking. But Elizabeth just has it restored. Well, the crucifix is hardly the thing that we would consider to be the defining definition between Catholicism and Protestantism. As we'll see here, Elizabeth is Protestant, but she pushes against one form of Protestantism that she finds to be abhorrent. But she is Protestant. In fact, within 1 year of her coming to the throne, in 1559, Elizabeth devises and brings together something that we know today as the religious settlement. Well, what the religious settlement is a return to Protestantism. During Mary's reign, the English nation as a whole and the Queen herself were received back into the Catholic Church after a certain amount of mea culpas had been done and a lot of restoration language and apologetic language had been issued to the Pope. Well, Elizabeth here, again, within 1 year, lurches the church back into the Protestant direction. That should be an indication to you that she is not going to be Catholic. Well, if she is Protestant, what is all this talk about Elizabeth being opposed to certain Protestants within her regime? The answer is she's opposed to an increasingly hardline Reformed position that is beginning to emerge from those who are coming back from exile. Now, a lot of this intensified Reformed Calvinism, you might say, is not inspired by Calvin himself. A lot of it comes from, in particular, a man by the name of John Knox. And we'll see in a minute that Calvin actually is really taken aback for being blamed for the way some of these more hardline folks are received or not received back in England. What had happened was, as these men were in exile, they had really intensified the hostility that they had to the English crown. And some, such as Knox and others, began to look back on the Edwardian Reformation not as baby steps, piecemeal efforts in the right direction, but as incomplete and half-hearted reformations. Now, this is a scandalous judgment, of course, in particular since Cranmer and others died at the stake for the sake of their reformation. But one of the things that happened to Knox is, by the end of Mary's reign, Knox had written a book that was about as poorly timed as you could ever imagine. It's a very famous book. It's called The First Blast Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. This book, of course, goes down in history as something of a misogynistic text. But we have to understand its context. Knox in 1558 is getting really, really suspicious and concerned at the three Marys, as they're called, which are three monarchs that included Queen Mary of England, who were Catholic and who were imposing Catholicism onto their countries. Well, the problem is within the English context, there had always been a real heavy commitment to the idea that the subjects under the crown do not rebel, ever. And in fact, everyone is pretty much unanimous on this issue. There are maybe one or two over the course of about 40 years or so who come to different conclusions. Well, Knox is one of these. But the problem is no one's going to go with Knox if he argues that you need to cast down all these queens and throw them out and start over, particularly with violence. No one had issued that kind of ideology, you might say, yet. There had been violence, but those are more the hot-blooded kinds. No one had made a case that regicide, as it's called, the killing of the monarch, was allowable according to Scripture. Well, what the first blast essentially does is because the door to rebellion is closed, he goes through the window. He argues strangely that women were ineligible because of their gender to rule at all in the political order. And this is all this book is really for. He's just trying to find a way, if you want to look at it in its context, to figure out a way to fight back. Now, it's telling. Everyone thought that Knox was just out to sea on this. They thought he was crazy. Calvin himself actually tells Knox that he thinks this is a horrible argument. Calvin actually points to the case of Deborah, who had ruled the Old Testament peoples. And though at this time no one considered females eligible for ordination, no one really had much of a problem theologically or biblically with a woman ruling a country in the political order. Certain countries had limited that, like France, and England was just now embarking on a long history of queens and kings ruling in England. But from a biblical theological standpoint, no one fought back on that, except for Knox here. But his purpose is to say, now we can fight back. Not because they're Catholic, but hey, they're a woman. We can take them out now. The problem is the book is published just a matter of months before Elizabeth comes to the throne. And Knox never really rescinds the argument. He never says he's sorry, but he does never make this argument again. Rather, going forward, he just says, no, let's just go ahead and say we can kill a king or a queen. We can stand up against tyranny. So he's moved on beyond this argument. Doesn't make it a good thing, but it makes it at least understandable. Well, as you can imagine, Elizabeth and her entourage are just going to not have anything to do with this kind of a full-throated, angry Protestantism coming back into England. Famously, in fact, Knox had been a priest under Edward in England. He's known for his role in the Scottish Reformation, but he had been a priest in the English context. Well, not anymore. He is barred. And others who have really the stench of this are considered to be men who are not to be trusted. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, in fact, Matthew Parker, who comes to the seat of the archbishopric under Elizabeth right off the bat, he is selected immediately. What's telling is he himself was reformed. He had actually studied under Martin Bucer. Martin Bucer had been Calvin's mentor. He saw himself as reformed. But when he came to the throne, he wrote a letter to the man who would become Secretary of State, William Cecil. And he says, one of the things we're going to be concerned about is this really feisty, angry, reformed voice that is coming back. Now, that doesn't mean that he is anti-Protestant, and it doesn't mean Elizabeth is going to be anti-Protestant. William Cecil himself, by the way, was also reformed. And, more importantly, all of the bishops and the priests and the people that were backed and supported and installed during Elizabeth's reign were from a robustly Protestant position. What made them different, though, is they were not from this feistier, more aggressive and unhappy lot. Now, it's a bit unfair to say that, but that really is how they are characterized, and it's how they act. So, for example, 1570, 12 years into Elizabeth's reign, there arose something called the vestments controversy, which is a controversy where those who were of a more stodgy, committed, aggressive Protestantism began to take a stand that if selected to be a priest or a pastor or a bishop even, they were not going to wear the vestments. These were things from the Catholic Church, and they didn't want anything to do with this. Well, Matthew Parker and the Queen and others say, put them on, guys. Just shut up. We're not saying the vestments are necessary to make you a Catholic priest. Rather, what Elizabeth wanted is a uniform clergy who, in a divided country that was still pretty heavily Catholic, she wanted a united clergy. And these guys are rocking the boat. So as Elizabeth's reign unfolds and develops, it increasingly comes to the point where And this will have a dramatic impact on the near future and the far future in the English-speaking world. Elizabeth and her main supporters there, both from the Secretary of State position, as well as from the archbishops of Canterbury that she will select throughout her reign, they are going to be committed Protestants, and you might say Reformed, but they're going to use their Protestant theology to go against these hardliners. You just look at the evidence, it's actually quite telling. Both sides are citing the same people: Calvin, Bullinger, Butzer, Zwingli, Peter Martyr, and others. They're saying, no, they're on our side. We need to not wear the vestments or these kinds of things. And the other side says, no, they're on our side. Conform. Stop being such a whiner. Stop trying to make yourself so important and resist all these things. What begins to happen here then is you have the emergence of a group that we will later call the Puritans. Now, defining who the Puritans are is important, and we'll do that as we go through this course, when we get to the actual Puritans, particularly under King James and others. But the origins of it really begin here, because the name Puritan just means those who want to purify and to establish anew the English church. They wanted, you might say, to continue what Edward wanted to do, which is to get rid of any vestige whatsoever of any cultural thing, whether it's vestments or crucifixes or whatnot, that appeared to be Catholic. Catholic doctrine had already been truncated. What they're fighting against is that culture. Are they going to go the way of a more reformed, you might say Calvinistic way of doing things? Or are they going to form a new identity that is not overly concerned with these things to the point of creating controversy over them? In the end, the Puritans will come into existence because as they carry on through the decades, in particular after the death of Elizabeth and on into the next century, they will become a self-identified group in some ways who challenge and continually stand up against things that they think are, quote, but half reformed. And as they get feistier, eventually you have groups that will become not internal Puritans who are complaining about things, but separatists, people who want to leave the Church of England and either found new denominations, like a Baptist structure, a Presbyterian structure, or something else. And eventually they will come to bash heads, metaphorically speaking, with the very king in the next century. Anglicanism, then, you might say, it's not a mixture, some sort of Frankenstein church between Catholicism and Protestantism. Rather, you might say, they are their own identity, they are Protestant, but they are not going to identify themselves with an increasingly hardline Reformed or Calvinistic side, and they are not going to simply adopt the Lutheran side. They want to form their own identity and not be beholden to another theologian. And it's telling. In the English-speaking world in particular, the word Calvinist, during Elizabeth's reign and on into the next century, begins to mean not the teachings of Calvin per se, though it certainly meant that in general, but rather this intensified, more aggressive form of Protestantism. And it's for that reason, in part, that the word Calvinist, in some ways down until even the modern world, has both a positive tone if you are Calvinist, and for those who may not realize it, some of the negative connotations, some of the pushback against the Reformed position in the English-speaking world that then transitions to the New World with the formations of English settlements here, will be very uncomfortable with the way Calvinism rests within the Anglican ethos. And so as the years wear on, you have this internal struggle, you might say, from time to time, between Calvinism or Puritanism and an alternative.